So, once more, I'll have to apologise if my voice, which gets affected at night at the moment with this cold, gets in the way a little bit. But tonight, to some extent, what I want to do, apart from clearing my throat, is to begin to take a step towards what will be happening tomorrow night. I think it'll be happening in town, at the centre in town, where we are going to be looking into the Heart Sutra in depth, the great Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra. To the extent that tonight I want to touch into the fact that when we say form is emptiness and emptiness is form, we're not saying the same thing twice, not even remotely. When we say form is emptiness, we're pointing to that great expansive experience of heart and mind opening without restriction, without boundaries, without any kind of sense of dividedness, even down to birth and death, and no ending of birth and death. Those two completely clear and unopposed. When we say emptiness is form, we are bringing ourselves back decidedly into this mortal body, into our care for the world, into the fact that we here partake of the lives of all beings. All beings create this one body of reality. And all beings by nature will die. In other words, our mortal body is completely brought together with the unborn body that is not born and cannot die. You could say that in realization, birth and death join hands, they meet completely and dissolve into each other. This is a mystery, not so much one of understanding, but one of direct experience of body and mind dropping away, and that direct experience opening as what we are. So we will be looking at that tomorrow night, but tonight I want to look at it very much in the context of what you might call, maybe it sort of comes along a bit from last night's talk about, remember the black wind that is always blowing us towards the land of the Rakshasas? Well, this one is more about falling into hell. So, again, I'm taking up a case from Entangling Vines. This is case 13, known as Lang Zhong's, sorry about this, Lang Zhong's hell. So a monk asked Zhao Zhou, do enlightened teachers ever fall into hell? And Zhao Zhou replied, it can be translated one of two ways actually. They're the first to go there, or I'll be the first to go there. But you're an enlightened teacher, why would you fall into hell? Zhao Zhou replied, if I didn't fall into hell, how could I help you? If I didn't fall into hell, how could I help you? Interesting. Two slightly different intonation patterns there maybe bring out more richness in his response. But in every case with Zhao Zhou, he meets the student exactly where they are. And if this student is speaking about his own fall into hell in some form, and all of us here know a little bit about the possibility of falling into hell. falling into a hell of our own making, or not even always of our own making. But this fall into hell, I think, is a resonant phrase that no one will miss the meaning of. So he meets the student exactly where they are. The student's suffering is also Teisho's suffering. How could I help you if I didn't fall immediately into hell? Now this is also admitting fully, frankly, openly that human beings always are on the edge of falling into delusion about themselves. Even the great, clear, wondrous Teisho would admit, I think frankly, to the people he was with, that he too could fall into hell at any moment. This is not the same as saying his realization or his wisdom was lacking. It's simply saying that human beings continually realize the truth of suffering. And the truth of suffering is actually lying in the fact that we all share that suffering. You could say that the truth of suffering, remember that the First Noble Truth is the truth of suffering, not just the fact of suffering. You don't need an enlightened Buddha to tell you about the fact of suffering. But the Buddha gave us access to the truth of suffering. And the truth of suffering is that there is no possible realization of all beings, one body. That's a beautiful translation of our first Bodhisattva vow. I vow to save the many beings. How? Or the realization of all beings, one body, one vastly interconnected and resonant body, sharing suffering. Sharing the fact of suffering and uncovering in that fact the truth of suffering. So the truth of suffering is the wondrous fact of your suffering is also my suffering. The fact of my suffering opens the way to see and receive and fully be with and share your suffering. So, now that's a way that begins to make a deeper sense of, do enlightened teachers ever fall into hell? They are the first to go there. There's a sort of old understanding that bodhisattvas do most of their work in hell. That's where the great work lies, in the hell of our world, not the heavens. The heavens are easy to an extent. We can all experience a little bliss and decide we'll hang out there for a while, in one form or another. The temptation to bypass suffering is acute in all of us, to bypass our own suffering as quickly as possible. However, to be the first to go there is to say suffering is the great Dharma gate. And Teisho is declaring, that gate is always open, I'll always walk through it. So in a way he's saying there is no end to the value and the truth of suffering. Very simply put, our path is not one of denial of suffering or of avoiding of suffering, but of never turning away from the suffering of others, and not turning away from our own suffering as if it is some kind of mistake or blot on our perfect spiritual path, or as that monk implies, but you're an enlightened teacher, why would you fall into hell? So let's look at another person sort of in a way falling into hell. And this is again a case from the Hidden Lamp. And it is a student, in fact, of Hakuin's, or she became one, Satsujo, 17th century Japan, 18th century Japan. So I'll read the case as it is here. When Satsujo, a great disciple of Hakuin, and she was, by the way, Hakuin took great pleasure in Satsujo. She was one who upturned things. For example, she was found as a teenager sitting on top of the Lotus Sutra. Now this was seen as a great mixing up, a great impure act to put your own ass on top of the Lotus Sutra. She said, what's the difference between the Lotus Sutra and my ass? And she was not disparaging the Lotus Sutra. She was upholding emptiness is form. So, when she was, as a great disciple of Hakuin, eventually she was old, as with luck we all are, and she lost her granddaughter. Her granddaughter died, which grieved her very deeply. So an old man from a neighbourhood, an old busybody, it sounds like, came and admonished her, saying, "Why are you wailing so much? If people hear this, they'll say, the old lady once studied with Hakuin and was enlightened, so now why is she mourning her granddaughter so much? You ought to lighten up a bit." It's interesting how often people who are grieving are told to move on, to lighten up, to please relieve us of the stress of your grieving upon me. Satsujo glared at her neighbour and scolded him. "You bald-headed fool, what do you know? My tears and weeping are better for my granddaughter than any amount of incense, flowers and lamps." In other words, all the traditional accoutrements of official mourning were nothing to her. Her crying, her weeping, her distress. This grief was the true measure of her love. And it said that the old man left without a word. We don't know much about what silenced him. Perhaps it was the shock. Perhaps he actually saw something in the tenderness of her admonishment. Perhaps he actually glimpsed something about the need to listen more closely to suffering, to find out what it is that we may be missing, that we may not yet have woken up as realization in ourselves. But before I go there, I'll just mention that this particular case is preceded by the one of Kasigatami's mustard seed. This is the famous story about the disciple, the woman disciple of the Buddha, who came in great distress with her dead child in her arms, saying, "The child is dead, no one can help me." And someone directed her to the Buddha, and he said, "I'll give you medicine to revive your child back to life if you bring me a mustard seed, just one mustard seed, from the house, from any house you can find where no one has died." And so the story is very familiar to most of you, I'm sure. She goes from house to house to try to get this magical mustard seed of there is the possibility that no one has ever died. And she finds in every house, she learns that someone had died. So carrying the child's body, she comes back to the Buddha, who says, "Did you bring me a mustard seed?" And her realization is, "I thought death had happened only to my little son, but now I understand impermanence belongs to us all." And that nobody can be ultimately protected from distress. And in fact, why ultimately would we try to be protected from distress? The distress of loss of the ones we love. Many of you know, or some of you know, that I recently lost a beloved dog. That might sound small alongside a child, but if you have had a dog and loved a dog, you'll know it's not small. The circumstances of his death were a tragic oversight that happened right on the eve of an occasion of celebration of my daughter's wedding. And so this was a very deep loss, a tragic loss for me, a fall into hell, I would say, that was immediate and completely beyond refusal. There was no way that I could or would stop the crying and, I guess you could say, the agonized wailing that had to happen. That might sound not circumspect enough for someone who sits in this seat, but I would say that it was the very measure, that ordeal of grief was and is the very measure of love. And the love that is there between you and a beloved animal, it's very deep. It's not just deep, it's so immediate, it is so soul to soul, because the animal, the creature, the beloved Shufti, was his name, was so completely himself, with such meticulous integrity about that fact. That in fact, there's no gap between you and that integrity. It rouses the integrity of your own feelings. So grief is a form of praise for the fundamental good that we call love. And I would say that bearing and containing an agonizing loss is our human work here on this earth. The mixing up of grief and love was very sharp on that occasion. Love also because we were celebrating love. My daughter's love for my beloved son-in-law. And it's very interesting that joy and grief come utterly mixed. They come utterly mixed when we wake up. To wake up is a kind of, sometimes described as a kind of grievous joy. By that I mean, as I spoke about a little bit last night, there is no joy without sorrow, without a sense of the wholeness of joy. It completely embraces and accepts and would never reject grief and sorrow. It brings it all with it. It's almost, you could say, that we are torn. Realization is a tearing into wholeness. We are torn into wholeness, into realization of wholeness. So the tearing that is part of every human life on earth, every life on earth, offers a kind of closing of the wound of separateness. You could say it's a kind of very severe form of grace that we as mortal beings receive. And as I said at the beginning, in realization, birth and death are peculiarly indistinguishable. They never could have been seen apart or told apart from that point of view. And the Heart Sutra very much speaks from that point of view. The point of view that cannot say birth and death, and no birth and no death, cannot possibly be separated into or taken apart from each other, told apart from each other. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. There's another case which I didn't have with me to read you in full, but I can tell it to you, where Teisho also underlines the importance of lament. Lament, I think, is this kind of overlooked, what would you really call it? Gift. We don't give this gift very often anymore, lament. When my dog, my beautiful Shufti, when I was sitting with his body and crying loudly, it would seem, because all the cows from the neighbouring field came over. I guess you could say a cry of pain. Those cows responded. They just, their beautiful big heads were all gathered, offered over the fence. And I've seen cows respond in similar circumstances before. They hear the cries of the world. Perhaps they are kunanyi. So in this particular case of lament, this cry torn from the throat, Teisho turned it round to show in what way it is a gift and a benefit. So again, it was about a woman who Teisho, she lived near where Teisho was teaching. And she also wept bitterly and loudly for the loss of her child. Many centuries earlier than Satsujo. This would be 9th century, late 8th, early 9th century China. And when people admonished the woman and came and told Teisho in great annoyance about this loud, wailing woman, Teisho said these beautiful words. He said, oh, by the way, the woman, when she was admonished, said, listen, listen, this cry is for all beings. Listen, listen. Nevertheless, people came and complained to Teisho to put things right again. You know, people shouldn't be crying. Equanimity should always trump human nature. Teisho put things right this way. He said, how can anyone lose by crying out? How can anyone lose by crying out? At the very least, it joins us together. Think of the way, how contagious, in the best way, grief is at a funeral, even if it's someone you don't know very well. I think you could say permission to grieve is given at a funeral. I sometimes think every suburb, every town, every city should have a consecrated place somewhere in it where people who need to lament can come and freely lament. I think there's not enough tears that are shed for all the pain of the world. So how can anyone lose by crying out? If at the very least, even the most small advantage of it is it may teach us to listen better. Crying out in lament is a kind of prayer, a cry for help. Not necessarily addressed to something, someone, something, some force. I guess you could say it simply like any moment of prayer, you are thrown beyond yourself by need, necessity, or whatever it is that evokes a kind of prayer, a cry from you beyond yourself. Talking about this with someone today, commented that practice itself is very much like a prayer. It is a kind of prayer for wholeness. It is a movement beyond the self to regain a wholeness, to heal the split that our consciousness has imposed upon that which is undivided. I've often liked and mentioned the story of Odysseus. The best part of the Odyssey for me, the most interesting part, is the moment when Odysseus is, he's shipwrecked quite a few times, but this is a very thoroughgoing shipwreck, when everyone else is lost to the sea, and just Odysseus is left floundering in the waves, in huge waves, and a strong current that is sweeping him away from the shore and towards rocks that will dash his brains out. And he does not know how to cry out for help in that place, because he does not know the names of the spirits of that place. He doesn't know how to name the old ones of that place. And I think I like this story because it reminds me of my own, I think our own shame, that we do not know how to address the old ones of this place where we find ourselves. We don't know how to cry out the names of the ancestors of this earth, the part of the earth where we find ourselves. Odysseus doesn't know the names of the gods, so he cries out to the unknown God. He cries out, effectively apologizing that he can't call them by name, and they respond. Another current sweeps him around the headland and washes him half dead onto a beach, and things proceed from there. It's the second last, actually you could say it's the last stopping place before he finally returns to Ithaca and reaches home, and then has to put a lot of people to the sword. Not a very pretty ending. However, putting that aside for the moment, I think this cry out to the unknown is a beautiful point in that moment. When we chant Kanzeon, that chant, we are in fact calling on the name of Kanzeon, calling up and calling on compassion, the embodiment of compassion that we call Kanon, Kanzeon, Guanyin, Kuan-yin, Avalokiteshvara. It's all the same part of ourselves that can lie as dead as a log if we're not careful. It's calling it up to life. It's calling up the ability to hear the cries of the world, the ability that's in each of us to hear the lament of other beings. So painful experience is a pull to the center, away from the easy periphery where we would hang out for most of our lives if we possibly could. Relaxed, as John Howard infamously said, relaxed and comfortable. That's all we apparently need or want to be. Well, Hafiz, the Sufi poet, says this: like a compass, I was circling with ease on the periphery of things. Like a point, that would be a very sharp point, I was pulled into the center by the cycle of time. I think we all are pulled into the center by the cycle of time. We could call it old age, sickness, and death. Could call it all forms of these strange guarantees of our humanity, and of the fact that all beings are one body of reality. There's an old Chinese poem that says something like this: how can you have the tender blossoms of spring without winter biting deep into your bones? Or to put it in more current Australian terms, how can you receive the cool blessing of autumn without traversing the furnaces of the new Australian summer? Which brings me to the question of the value of grief and shame in the light of the planetary emergency we now share. We have no choice but to endure it and to share it. And I think for that matter, not unrelatedly, the grief and shame and the necessary formal acceptance of despair and of our cruelty and of our failure as a settler society here. One that decided to declare terra nullius, empty earth. Think about that. Think about how that particular curse comes back upon us as we face. Australia is likely to experience the very first and the most savage ravages of global warming. It's already happening. So, all the old patterns of history, the pattern in which a hell is made on earth, we make a kind of hell on earth, and then we cover it up with mendacity. That's the human pattern. And if you doubt me, consider Manus and Nauru right now, and the enormous helpings of mendacity that are attempting to cover up the stench of that. So this is like the background hum of our lives. There is much to lament, much to acknowledge. The desecration of the living world, the brutalities that go with that they're made in our name, and we all must bear them as psychic wounds. We must be the first to go there, to go to the painful place and admit it as our own pain, to bear witness, to see clearly, to make frank acknowledgement, to cry out loudly, cry out. Not just the cows need to come to the fence, the whole human setup has to come to its senses about the appropriate demand of grief, the grief that deserves appropriate demand, which is, of course, the appropriate demand of love. Grief and love. You cannot ultimately tear them apart. The Turkish poet Anatoly Silin says, by grief alone is love perfected. By grief alone is love perfected. Compare that with how can anyone lose by crying out? Or by truly hearing the cry. So, the descents we might make into hell and pain and suffering and grief, and the donation of self that happens in that state, giving away of the self into that grief. Lament is a complete giving away of the self into grief. It has a kind of echo in the giving away of self in our practice. Both the path of awakening and the path of acknowledging the truth of suffering, realizing the truth of suffering, embodying the truth of suffering. Both these come together with a form of dying to the self. And in that dying to the self, the saving of the many beings. So as I started out by saying, emptiness is form. We're here on this path to realize what being might really be, human being, which is always richly entangled with emptiness and with unavoidable suffering. I'm not talking about foolish, neurotic, self-created suffering at this point, of course. So, we're here to do that, you, me, us, at a very acute moment in human history. We're called to realize what being may be at the very moment when we are, by our actions, unmaking countless forms of being on the earth, extinctions. We are here at the unraveling of the life world. It is at our hands that this is happening. You could even say, as Deborah Bird Rose has said, really interesting anthropologist, Australian anthropologist, said, this is the undoing of life and death itself. Extinction is actually the death of death. It's an extraordinary finality there. So, I would say that digesting and also being digested about grief for the world is an incredibly important process in our possible redemption. We do not know if human beings are going to survive human beings. We don't know. To just survive ourselves, our separate selves, from which we seem to have so much trouble in parting with this separate self. That seems to be very, very hard for the earth to have to bear, that fact. But there is no true joy without the arduousness of sorrow. This is the real, you could almost say, the gold standard of joy is found in our ability to realize this truth of suffering, of mortal suffering. And I wanted to end just by coming back to that part of the Lojong that we've been playing with a bit in this session. The Lojong slogan, do good, avoid evil, appreciate your lunacy, and pray for help. And I want to come to that pray for help part. And I want to come to it by way of Martin Prechtal, who's a very interesting shamanic figure he's actually North American, German father, Mayan, Hopi mother. And he ended up becoming a shaman, a genuine one, not a weekend shaman. He spent 18 years living as a village shaman in a Mayan village of about 18,000 people before the purges there of the Mayan people drove him out to safety in America, back to America. But he talks about a beautiful blessing that is offered to people when you're parting company with them, when you're saying goodbye. In Mayan terms, this is what you say. You say, long life, honey in the heart, no evil, and 13 thank yous. And I don't know about you, but I can hear both prayer and blessing in this. There's a sense of it almost being offered as an amulet of safety, go safely, go with long life, honey in the heart, no evil, 13 thank yous. The 13 thank yous are almost like preempting and saying, we're already thanking for no evil, long life, honey in the heart. It's coming to you, don't worry about it. Go forth with safety. There is that aspect of it. But how is it a prayer as well? Well, when you look at it, what is this long life that is being called up at that moment? I would say that every fully inhabited moment of our lives, there it is, there's long life. What about honey in the heart? It's a beautiful expression of what we talked about last night as the good, the recognizable good. that you can't walk past. You know it. When you see it, it's already recognized you. Honey in the heart, isn't that the instantly recognizable good? It's as simple as the way the rain fell this morning after a dry spell. As the earth got wet, at least a little. A simple matter. And as simple as the inevitability of love becoming all there is, of prevailing over even our most hellish shortcomings. As for no evil, of course this is in the spirit of saying, may no evil befall you as you go on your way. It is a preemptive kind of prayer for help. But if it's a prayer for help, what's the ultimate move of this help? Surely it's not turning away. No help is possible if we turn away. Help is the act of not turning away. And surely that is our very practice here on the path of Zen. Wishing for no evil, wishing for honey in the heart, wishing for long life, these are very much like metta practice, are they not? May you be well and happy. May you be at peace. May you be safe. May you be free from suffering, and so on. This is the form of prayer as, I guess you could say, well-wishing that doesn't have me in it. It's completely offered out. It flows outward to the other. Of course, it's offered to yourself as well, but not me, myself. It's offered to the sense of the one who is part of the flow, giving and receiving, one thing. So prayer, in a very deep sense, is the turn toward what is happening, the cry for help, the prayer for help. To pray for help is to turn towards what is happening. And as for 13 thank yous, well, that's a way of saying, I love the particularity of 13. It's very endearing. But if we say 13, we're saying essentially there's no end to thank you. There's no end to gratitude. There's no end to that as the fundamental prayer. Someone once said the only prayer you ever really need might have been, who was it? It was one of those old Christian mystics. He said the only prayer that anyone ever really needs is thank you. That's the fundamental prayer, thank you. There is no end to thank you. The only prayer we ever finally need. So, thank you.